To my only real daughter. That is what my father said, into a microphone, in front of 47 people, with me sitting 6 feet away at table 3. I want you to hold that sentence for a moment. Not the cruelty of it, you can feel that without my help, but the particular calm in his voice when he said it. The way he smiled at Stephanie while she covered her mouth with her hand, happy crying, the way people do when they believe they've earned something. He didn't stumble. He didn't flinch. He said it like a fact, the way you'd say the sky was blue, or winter was cold, or some things simply were what they were. I'll tell you what happened next. But not yet. What I want you to know first is that the man in the chair beside me, the one nobody at that reception had been formally introduced to, the one who'd driven 4 hours in a dark sedan to attend a wedding he hadn't been invited to, heard every word my father said. And then he stood up. What he said when he stood is the part none of them saw coming. Not my father, not Stephanie, not the 47 people holding their champagne flutes in the golden September light of the Harrowfield Country Club. They thought the story ended with the toast. It didn't. Welcome back. This is a place for quiet stories about ordinary people who set a table for the ones who showed up and learn, finally, who that is. If you have ever sat in a room full of your own family and felt like a stranger at someone else's party, this one is for you. Stay with me, because the part that changes everything does not happen at the microphone. It happens in an attorney's office, 7 months earlier on a Tuesday afternoon, when a man I barely knew looked across a conference table and told me what my grandfather had left behind. Drop a comment and subscribe. I won't rush this. It's worth taking slowly. Let me take you back to where I actually start. Not the wedding, before that. My name is Claire Whitmore and I grew up in Harrowfield, Virginia, in a 2-story colonial on a street where the lawns were edged and the mailboxes matched. From the outside, we looked exactly like what we were supposed to be. Robert Whitmore, Regional Sales Director. His wife Linda, who substituted at the elementary school and organized the neighborhood 4th of July. Their 2 daughters, Stephanie and me. Stephanie is 3 years older. She has my father's eyes and my mother's laugh, and a way of entering a room that makes people look up. She was the cheerleader, the homecoming attendant, the one who got the car at 16, because she asked for it in front of company, and my father had never learned to say no to her in front of witnesses. I watched how that worked from an early age, and I decided I would never be the kind of person who needed an audience to get what I wanted. That decision cost me a lot over the years. Turns out, in my family, the audience was the whole point. My grandfather, Wallace Whitmore, my father's father, was not a man who needed witnesses either. He had served 22 years in the Army, retiring as a master sergeant in 1991, and had the particular bearing of a man who had learned to do the important things quietly and without ceremony. Drove a 15-year-old truck and ate the same breakfast every morning, 2 eggs, toast, black coffee, and kept his feelings mostly to himself, which meant that when he did say something, you paid attention. He said 2 things to me that I carried for the rest of my life. The first was when I was 9, sitting on the tailgate of that truck while he cleaned his tools. He said, "Claire, people who make the most noise usually have the least to say. Remember that." I didn't fully understand it then. I understood it completely by the time I was 31. The second thing he said, I won't tell you yet. It belongs later in the story, where it can do what he intended it to do. I work for a defense logistics firm in Arlington. I coordinate supply chain compliance for government contracts, the kind of job that sounds deliberately unimpressive at dinner parties, which suits me fine. I am good at it in the specific way that people who were trained from childhood to be invisible are good at things that require sustained, unwitnessed effort. I track details. I follow paper trails. I know how to read a contract for what it doesn't say as much as what it does. I got there by accident, or what felt like accident at the time but looks more like inevitability from the back. I had applied to law school at 23 and was accepted. I deferred. Then deferred again. Then quietly decided that what I actually wanted was not to argue for outcomes, but to build the systems that made outcomes possible. The unglamorous scaffolding, the documentation architecture, the compliance frameworks that nobody reads until something goes wrong. I enrolled in a graduate program in logistics and information management. My father asked, at Thanksgiving that year, whether I had given up on law school. I said I was going a different direction. He nodded and turned back to Stephanie, who had just gotten a promotion that sounded important. I did not resent him for that. I noted it. There is a difference. I had a long time to learn the difference, and learning it made my life considerably more bearable. My father never learned what I did exactly. When people asked at parties, he said I worked for the government, vaguely, as though the vagueness was for my protection rather than his convenience. Stephanie worked in marketing for a regional property firm, and my father described her job with the specificity of a man who had memorized the press release. He knew her quarterly targets. He knew the name of her direct supervisor. He knew the color palette of the campaign she'd led the previous fall. He knew I worked with contracts. That was the extent of it. It did not wound me the way it might have once. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had made a kind of peace with being the quiet one, the competent one, the one who showed up reliably and without fanfare, and was noted mostly in her absence. I had a small apartment in Arlington with a good kitchen that I used, and a filing system that other people at work asked me to replicate. I had a cat named for a general, not Hawes. A different one, Patton, who knocked things off my desk with a methodical indifference I found deeply comforting. I had a life I had built myself. It did not look impressive from the outside. It was mine down to the bones. Grandfather Wallace lived alone in the house on Birch Road after my grandmother passed, and I drove out to see him most Sundays when I wasn't traveling for work. It was a 40-minute drive from my apartment, and I made it without anyone asking me to, which meant no one in my family noticed it was happening. This is a specific kind of invisibility, the kind where the absence of complaint gets mistaken for the absence of effort. He taught me to play chess on those Sundays. He made coffee that was too strong and sandwiches that were too thick, and he told stories about his service in the way veterans do, obliquely, with the real weight of them tucked behind the facts. He talked about the men he served with the way you talk about people you trust more than family, because for him, they were. Those Sunday drives through Harrowfield and out the back roads toward Birch Road were one of the fixed points of my week, the kind of thing that costs nothing and holds more than you understand until one day it is gone and the absence is the weight of it. I brought good bread sometimes, or the crossword from the Saturday paper if I'd held it. He always had the chessboard set up before I knocked. He told me once that he set it up the night before so it would be ready. I had not known that. I thought about it for a long time afterward. One name came up more than the others when he talked about his service. General Bernard Hawes, retired now, he'd said, lives out toward Winchester, a good man, a man who does what he says and says only what he means. I asked once how they had met. Grandfather Wallace smiled into his coffee. He was my commanding officer for 6 years, he said. Then he looked up. And the best friend I ever had for 30 after that. I filed that away. I didn't know then that it was a load I was carrying for someone else. Grandfather Wallace's health started declining in the spring of the year before the wedding. Not dramatically. The way a good building settles, quietly, in increments that only someone paying attention would catch. He was slower on the stairs. He repeated a story about Okinawa twice in the same afternoon. He didn't finish his sandwiches. My father began calling him more frequently, which I noticed because my father had not called him frequently before. Stephanie started showing up on Sunday afternoons, which I also noticed, because in the 8 years I had been driving out there, I had never once pulled into that driveway and found her car. She brought things, pies from the bakery, flowers. She hugged him at the door with the full-body enthusiasm of a woman who had just remembered she had a grandfather. I watched it and I said nothing, because pointing it out would have required me to keep score, and keeping score was not something I was willing to do. The folded envelope was on the kitchen table the last Sunday I visited him before he was admitted to the hospital. A cream-colored envelope, heavier than standard, sealed with a strip of packing tape and addressed in his handwriting to General Bernard Hawes, the address out toward Winchester in his looping military print. Beside it, his reading glasses. Beside those, a pen. He was in the living room. I brought him his coffee and didn't mention the envelope. He didn't mention it either. We played chess. He beat me in 11 moves, which he hadn't done in 2 years, and when I looked up, surprised, he was smiling. Some days are like that, he said. He was admitted to the hospital 6 days later. I didn't find out until my father called to tell me, matter-of-factly, the way he called about most things that required me to react, that my grandfather had been admitted, that it was serious, that the family was gathering. He said the family as though it were a category I belonged to. By then I had learned to notice the gap between the word and the meaning. I drove out that evening. By the time I arrived, my father and Stephanie were in the hallway speaking in hushed voices with a look between them that I recognized from childhood, the look of two people who have already talked about something and are deciding how much to tell the third person. My mother was in the room with Grandfather Wallace, holding his hand and watching the monitor. She was better at presents than most of them. I'll give her that. I sat with him until 9. He was quiet. At one point, he opened his eyes and said, "The letter." I said I had seen it on the table. He closed his eyes again. He died on a Thursday morning in February, 11 days later. He was 78 years old and he had lived with more dignity than almost anyone I have ever known. The cream envelope was no longer on the kitchen table when we cleaned out the house. Someone had moved it, or taken it, or it had been mailed. I didn't know which. I told myself it didn't matter. I was wrong about that. Stephanie announced her engagement 3 weeks after the funeral. To his credit, my father waited until the 48-hour mourning period was over before he pivoted entirely to wedding enthusiasm. Stephanie's fiancé was a man named Derek, personable and agreeable in the way that some men are who have made a career out of not being difficult. They were a good match. I mean that without bitterness. He was gentle with her, and that mattered. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of September, 8 months away. My father threw himself into the planning with the energy of a man who had found his purpose. He and Stephanie had long phone calls about venues and florists, and whether the reception dinner should be plated or family style. I was not included in these calls, which was fine. I was not the one getting married. What was not fine, though I didn't know it yet, was something that had happened 4 months earlier, while my grandfather was still alive. I learned about it on a Tuesday in March, from a woman named Patricia Greer at the offices of Harrowfield Estates and Trust, a small firm off Court Street that handled wills and probate for the county. She had called my cell phone, which I thought was odd, because I had not engaged them in any capacity. She asked carefully whether I was aware that I had been named in a codicil to my grandfather's will. I was not. She asked whether I would be able to come in. I came in the following Tuesday. Patricia Greer was a woman in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried, with the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years delivering information that changed people's lives and had learned to do it without drama. She told me that my grandfather had amended his will 7 months earlier, in August of the year before he died. The amendment was a codicil, formally executed, witnessed, and notarized, which added a distribution to a separate testamentary trust. The trust named me, Claire Ann Whitmore, as beneficiary of an amount totaling $340,000, which represented the proceeds of the sale of the house on Birch Road, and a savings account my grandfather had accumulated over 30 years of careful living. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I asked the question that was really the only question. What does my father receive? Patricia Greer looked at her papers. Your grandfather's primary estate, his truck, his personal effects, his military pension balance, passes to your father as primary heir under the original will. The trust was established separately. It does not pass through probate. My father would not have known about the codicil until probate was opened. The original will named him. The codicil, added later, directed the house and the savings to me through a trust that bypassed the estate. But Patricia Greer said, and here she paused the way people pause when something has already happened that they wish had not, there is a complication. She told me, 4 months earlier in November, before my grandfather had been admitted to the hospital, someone had filed a power of attorney on his behalf. The POA named my father, Robert Whitmore, as his agent. Using that POA, my father had transferred the house on Birch Road out of my grandfather's individual name into a joint tenancy with Stephanie. The transfer had been executed by a notary in Harrowfield on a day my grandfather had no documented medical appointment and no record of legal counsel present. The savings account had been moved to a joint account with my father's name on it, 4 weeks before my grandfather died. The codicil, which directed both assets to a trust in my name, had been executed 8 months before all of this. Patricia Greer looked at me steadily. Your grandfather anticipated this, she said. He retained General Bernard Hawes as the third-party trustee of your trust, precisely because he anticipated this. I stared at her. She said, General Hawes is the one who contacted our office. He received your grandfather's letter in January and reached out to us the same week. He has been waiting for you to come in. I said, General Hawes already knew. She nodded. He has been handling the legal challenge on your behalf since February. I put my hands flat on the table, the way you do when the ground has shifted and you need to feel something solid under you. My grandfather had written that letter on the kitchen table, the cream envelope with the packing tape and the Winchester address. He had sent it before his decline made that impossible. He had named a man he trusted more than his own son to stand watch over what he intended for me. He had done it quietly, without telling me, without witnesses, without ceremony. because that was exactly who he was. I need to stop for a moment because I know some of you are doing the math on a family situation of your own right now, counting up the times someone moved something without asking, the decisions made in your absence, the plans that required you not to know. If that's you, leave one word below. I read every single one. And if you want to hear what General Haas said at that wedding table, stay with me. It's coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I met General Bernard Haas for the first time in his study in Winchester on a Thursday afternoon in March. He lived in a house that was neat and spare in the way of a man who had lived without clutter for 6 decades, a few books, a chess set on a side table, military photographs on one wall in plain frames. He was 73 years old, white-haired, with a posture that made you sit up straighter simply by being in the room. He shook my hand the way my grandfather used to, firm. Held for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, which means, I see you. I know who you are, he said. Your grandfather talked about you every time we spoke. For 30 years, I hadn't expected that. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just sat down. He explained what he knew. My grandfather had called him in August, shortly after amending the will and establishing the trust. He had been worried, he told the general. His son had begun appearing more frequently. Stephanie was visiting. There was a quality of attention that he recognized, the kind that arrives when there is something to be got. He was not a suspicious man, General Haas said, but he was a precise one. He understood what certain kinds of attention meant, and he wanted to make sure the right things were protected before the window closed. He gave me your grandfather's letter to read. I won't quote it fully here. Some things are private. But there was one line I can tell you, because it belongs to this story and he would have known that. He wrote, Claire is the one who kept showing up. Make sure she knows the table was set for her. I had not cried when he died. I had not cried through the probate notice or the meeting with Patricia Greer or the drive to Winchester. I had been moving through everything with the same steady forward motion I used at work, one foot in front of the other, all the feelings filed neatly for later. I cried then. A short, quiet cry into my hands that the general sat through without embarrassment, without rushing me, without saying anything at all. Then he passed me a box of tissues and said, Your grandfather also told me you play chess. I laughed. The kind that comes up from somewhere unexpected. Good, he said, we have work to do. Those monthly drives to Winchester became the quiet spine of the next several months. I want you to understand what that period felt like, because from the outside it looked like nothing, a woman going about her life, working her contracts, attending her sister's engagement party with a smile. From the inside, it was the most deliberate year of my life. I would arrive in Winchester around 2 on Saturdays. The general would have coffee ready, good coffee, the kind where you could tell he had cared about the grounds and the temperature of the water, and we would sit across the chessboard, and he would tell me what Patricia Greer's most recent filing had produced, and I would ask questions, and he would answer them with the patience of a man who believes that the person asking deserves to understand the whole shape of the thing, not just the part that involves them. He never spoke about my father with contempt. I want to note that because it mattered to me. He spoke about the situation with the analytical care of someone who has spent his life assessing terrain. This is what was done. This is the document that proves it. This is the argument the other side will make. This is what we have to counter it with. He did not ask me how I felt about any of it. One Saturday, I asked him why not. He thought about it. Then he said, Your grandfather told me you were practical. He said feelings and facts are both real, but when you have work to do, you start with the facts and let the feelings find their place after. I assumed you preferred it that way. I did. I had not known anyone else noticed. After chess, we would often sit with a second cup of coffee, and he would tell me about my grandfather. Not the things I already knew, not the army stories I had heard on those Sunday afternoons, but the smaller things that had accumulated over 30 years of friendship. The way my grandfather always mailed birthday cards a week early because he was afraid of being late. The trip they had taken to Montana in 2004, 2 old soldiers in a rental truck, fishing for 4 days, and talking about their families and the ways they had succeeded and the ways they had failed. The fact that my grandfather had told him, on that trip, that he had made mistakes as a father, and he was not sure they were fixable, but he wanted to try to correct at least one thing before he died. That trip was in 2004. He had been planning this, in some form, for nearly 20 years. I drove back to Arlington on those Saturdays through the early dark of late winter, then through the tentative green of March, then into the full warmth of spring, and I thought about the kind of love that works that quietly and that far in advance. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that simply does what needs to be done, and trusts that the right person will understand it in time. That was my inheritance. Not the money, though the money mattered, and I will not pretend otherwise, but the knowledge that someone had seen me clearly enough for long enough to build a structure around what he saw. That was the thing none of them had thought to check. The legal challenge moved slowly, the way these things do when the other side knows the system and uses it. My father had engaged an attorney. The POA was being contested. The joint tenancy transfer of the house was under challenge on the grounds that my grandfather had not had independent counsel present when he signed it, and that the document bore marks consistent with a rushed execution. This is the part of the story I will not dramatize because it is not dramatic. It is deliberate and slow, and it smells like printer toner and conference room coffee, and it takes months. There were filings and counter-filings, and a hearing date set for October, 6 weeks after the wedding. What I want to tell you instead is what was happening on the surface of my life during those months, because the surface and the underneath were running on completely different tracks. On the surface, I attended Sunday dinners when invited. I brought wine I had looked up how to select. I helped address wedding invitations for Stephanie at my mother's kitchen table one Saturday afternoon in June, which is how I found out that I had been assigned to table 3, which was the table nearest the kitchen door. I had been to enough weddings to know what table 3 meant. I didn't mention it. I addressed the envelopes. There were 47 of them. I addressed each one in my neat cursive, return address labels on the back flaps, stamps placed flush in the right corner. My mother worked beside me and we talked about ordinary things, a neighbor's garden, a movie she had seen, whether the caterer's salmon was a reliable choice in September heat. She was comfortable with me in those quiet domestic moments. It was the larger stages where she lost track of where I was. At one point she said, without quite looking at me, "You know your father is so happy about this wedding. It means everything to him." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "He just loves her so much." I folded an envelope. The wording was imprecise enough that I could have taken it any number of ways, and I chose the charitable one, because I was tired and I was working. Underneath, I was reading case law on undue influence in estate transfers. I was exchanging emails with Patricia Greer. I was driving to Winchester once a month to sit with General Haas, play chess, and work through the strategy for the October hearing in the careful, precise way that he approached everything. He never told me what to expect from my family, he didn't characterize them. He simply worked the problem. I respected that. It reminded me of my grandfather. Those Winchester months had their own texture, separate from everything else. I would arrive at 2 on Saturdays. The general would have coffee ready, the kind where you could tell someone had cared about the grounds and the temperature. We would work through what the filings had produced that week, and then we would play chess. And in the spaces between moves, he would tell me things about my grandfather I had not known. The way he always mailed birthday cards a week early because he was afraid of being late. The trip to Montana in 2004, 2 old soldiers in a rental truck, fishing for 4 days. The fact that my grandfather had told him, on that trip, that he had made mistakes as a father, and he was not sure they were fixable, but he wanted to try to correct at least one thing while there was still time. That trip was in 2004. He had been planning this for nearly 20 years. I drove back to Arlington on those Saturdays through the tentative green of April, then into the full warmth of May and June, and I thought about patience. The particular kind of patience required to build something for someone else's benefit over 20 years, and leave it for them without explanation, trusting them to find it when they needed it. My grandfather had not been a man who needed credit. He had been a man who needed things to be right. My father called twice during those months, both times about the wedding logistics. Neither time did he ask how I was. I noted it without judgment. I had a long practice of noting things without judgment. The setback came in July. The attorney my father had retained filed a challenge to the codicil itself, arguing that my grandfather's cognitive capacity had been diminished when he executed it in August of the prior year. This was 7 months before his hospitalization and 14 months before his death, but the challenge required a response. General Haas called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice was measured. "They are arguing he wasn't competent in August," he said. "There is a process to address this, but it will require documentation. Medical records, witness statements, evidence of capacity." I felt the floor drop. It was 7 months of work, and the filing was specifically timed to delay the October hearing and potentially invalidate the one instrument my grandfather had constructed to protect me. If the codicil was ruled invalid, the trust dissolved with it. Everything reverted to the original will. Everything went to my father to be distributed as he saw fit. I knew how he saw fit. I had been watching that for 31 years. I sat in my apartment for a long time that evening with the lights off and the phone in my lap. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call who would understand the specific weight of it, the legal complexity and the family complexity braided into something I had to carry quietly while also attending engagement parties and addressing envelopes and showing up to things without making noise. General Haas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I played chess with your grandfather in September. 2 weeks after he signed that codicil. I have photographs of that visit and notes I kept in my personal file. He beat me. I asked him on that visit to confirm to me in his own words that he understood what he had signed and that it was his intention. He did so clearly and I wrote it down. Oh, I said, your grandfather knew they would challenge it, Claire. He knew exactly what he was doing in August. That's why he called me." General Haas paused. "He did not want to leave you a fight. But he knew you could win one if it came to that." I sat for a long time in my apartment with the phone in my lap after we hung up. The hearing had been moved to early November. The wedding was in 6 weeks. I had a choice to make about whether to attend. I want to tell you that the choice was easy. It was not. My mother called on a Wednesday evening in late August and asked, with a careful warmth, whether I was planning to come to the rehearsal dinner. She did not ask whether I was planning to come to the wedding itself. She assumed that was settled. She assumed because she had always assumed that I would be present and quiet and uncomplicated, the way middle air is necessary and unnoticed. I said yes. I was coming. She sounded relieved, which told me that someone had wondered. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in downtown Harrowfield. I sat between a cousin I barely knew and Derek's aunt, who was very kind and asked about my work with genuine interest. My father gave a toast. He talked about Stephanie for 6 minutes, her kindness, her beauty, the joy she had brought to his life. He talked about Derek for 2. He talked about the future they would build together. He did not mention me. I drank my water and listened and thought about the hearing date in November and the stack of chess photographs in General Haas's personal file. After dinner in the coat room, my father appeared beside me. He smelled like scotch and the cedar of his good jacket. For one moment, standing there in the narrow space between the winter coats, his face did something I had not seen it do in a long time. It softened. He looked at me with something that was almost apology, something that was almost recognition. He opened his mouth. Then Stephanie came through the door, glowing, Derek behind her, and my father's face closed back up like a book. He put his hand on her shoulder and steered them toward the exit. He never finished the sentence. I don't know what it would have been. I don't know if it would have mattered. Some doors you spend years trying to open, and some you finally stop standing in front of. I buttoned my coat and went to get my car. The wedding was a Saturday in September, golden and warm in the way that early fall days in Virginia are, as though the season is apologizing for what is coming. The country club had been draped in white and ivory, and there were flowers on every surface, and the ceremony itself was beautiful. Stephanie looked the way brides look when they are genuinely happy, lit from inside, a little tearful, absolutely sure. I wore a navy dress I had bought for a conference 2 years earlier, and a pair of earrings my grandfather had given me for my 30th birthday, small gold ones in the shape of compass roses, because he said I always knew where I was going. I did not bring a date. There had been a man in my life for a while the previous year, someone careful and decent, but we had parted in the spring with mutual gentleness and I had not replaced him. I was not in the habit of bringing people into my family situations. It seemed unkind. Table 3 was near the kitchen door, as expected. 6 seats. A couple I didn't know from Derek's firm. The cousin from the rehearsal dinner. A great-uncle of Stephanie's who spoke very little but ate enthusiastically. And General Bernard Haas. I did not know he would be there. He was already seated when I arrived at the table, in a dark suit, no medals or insignia. This was a wedding, not a ceremony, with the erect stillness of a man who has spent decades in rooms where his presence changes the air. He looked up when I sat down. A brief nod, the kind that says, "I know you are here. I am here too. That is enough for now." I had not told him about the wedding. He had not told me he was coming. I found out later that he had received a card from my grandfather, written months before his death, mailed with instructions to hold it that said, September. Harrowfield Country Club, be there. She will need someone in her corner. Don't be noticed until the right moment. My grandfather had planned this. He had planned all of it. The dinner was lovely. I made conversation. I ate the salmon. The band played something instrumental and the candles flickered on the white tablecloths and the light was genuinely beautiful. Then the toasts began. Derek's best man went first. Then Stephanie's college roommate. Then my mother, who said the right things in the right order and got a little teary at the end, which was real. She loved Stephanie. She loved me too, in her way. She was simply a woman who had never been taught to say so without prompting. Then my father stood up. He took the microphone. He was comfortable with it. He had been the kind of man who made speeches at work functions, who gave the holiday toast at the neighborhood party, who was practiced in the performance of warmth for audiences. He talked about the day Stephanie was born. He talked about her first steps, her first school play, her first car. He talked about Derek with warm approval. He talked about grandchildren with a joke that made the room laugh. He talked about the woman Stephanie had grown into, her grace, her generosity, her beauty. He talked for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I counted. Then he lifted his glass. To my only real daughter, he said. He smiled at Stephanie. The room lifted their glasses. And I sat very still at table 3, with my hands in my lap and my compass rose earrings catching the candlelight, and I watched 47 people drink to a sentence that had just erased me from my own family in front of a room full of witnesses. Stephanie was crying. Derek's arm was around her. My mother was smiling, though something in her eyes had shifted, something uncertain and complicated that she smoothed away quickly. A few people near table 3 had heard. I saw the calculation on their faces, the quick social math of whether to react, and the decision not to. Easier, cleaner. The general had put down his glass without drinking. He sat for exactly 4 seconds, I know because I watched him. Then he stood up. He did not ask for the microphone, he did not raise his voice. He simply stood, which in a man of his bearing is its own form of volume. The room noticed. Rooms always notice a general. My father saw him and a confusion crossed his face. He did not know who this man was. Nobody at that wedding knew who this man was except me. General Haas looked at my father, then he looked at the room, and then he looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Bernard Haas. I served with Wallace Whitmore for 6 years and was his closest friend for 30 after that. He asked me to be here today." He paused. Wallace spoke about Claire in every conversation we had for 30 years. Her integrity, her reliability, her character. He said she was the person in his family he trusted most to carry what mattered forward. He told me once, more than once, actually, that she was the best of what he hoped his family would be. He looked at my father. Wallace is not here to say that himself, so he arranged for me to say it. He picked up his champagne glass. To Claire, he said, who was always the real thing, he drank. And the cousin from Derek's firm, who had been sitting to my left and who had heard every word of my father's toast, raised his glass. Then Derek's aunt. Then the great uncle. Then more, spreading outward through the room the way water moves through a low space, quietly, inevitably finding its level. Not everyone, but enough. I did not cry. I sat very still with my hands in my lap and I let the warmth of it come in slowly, the way warmth comes in after you have been cold for a long time. My father was still standing. His champagne glass was at his side and his face was doing something complicated and private, and I could not have told you what it was. Stephanie had stopped crying. She was looking at me with an expression I also could not read, something that was not quite guilt and not quite anger and maybe not quite anything she had words for yet. My mother had pressed her napkin to her mouth. The room settled. The band started up again. The caterers moved quietly between tables. General Haas sat back down beside me. He did not make it a moment, he simply sat. He said low, "Only for me, your grandfather wanted you to know." I said, "I know." He said, "No, he wanted you to know in front of them." I looked at my father, still standing at the head of the room, slowly recollecting himself, reaching for the smoothness that had always come easily to him. I watched him find it. I watched the performer return and take up his position. He sat down. He picked up his glass. He leaned toward Stephanie and said something that made her laugh. And I understood what General Haas meant. My grandfather had not just left me a trust. He had not just sent a letter to a friend. He had built a moment, carefully and at distance, for me to be seen clearly in a room where I had been made invisible. He could not be there to do it himself, so he sent Bernard Haas to do it for him. What followed was not a scene. I want to be clear about that, because life is not always a scene even when it probably should be. After the toasts, my father found me near the bar. He was carrying 2 glasses of water, which I understood as a peace offering of sorts, the way men in my family offered objects instead of words. He handed me one. I took it. He said, "I didn't mean," I waited to see if he would finish that sentence. He had not finished it in the coat room. I gave him this opportunity as well. He looked at his glass, he looked at the room. He looked at a point about 6 inches to the left of my face. He said, I didn't know Wallace felt. He trailed off again. Did you know about the trust? I said yes. He looked at me then, really looked. And I saw it, the thing that had been behind his eyes in the coat room, the almost apology, the almost recognition, the shape of a sentence he had been carrying and had never once managed to actually say. He said he always liked you better. Your grandfather, even when you were small. He said it with something that had grief in it, and something that had resentment in it, and something that had neither, just a fact. A fact he had been living with for 30 years. I didn't argue with him. I didn't perform the warmth I didn't feel or the forgiveness I hadn't gotten to yet. I said he saw me. That mattered to me. My father nodded. He drank his water. Then Stephanie was beside him, her hand on his arm, and his face rearranged itself into the familiar configuration of father of the bride, and the moment was gone. He did not finish the sentence. He never did. Some things settle into the shape of what they are finally, and you stop waiting for them to change. The hearing was in early November, a Tuesday, in a conference room that smelled like institutional carpet and fluorescent lighting. My father's attorney was there. Patricia Greer was there. General Hawes was there, with the photographs and the notes from September, and a quiet certainty that I had come to understand was simply who he was. My father sat across the table from me for the first time in a room that was not a family occasion. He looked older. He looked, I thought, like a man who had been carrying something he had not expected to carry. The challenge to the codicil was withdrawn before the hearing began. My father's attorney made a brief statement. My father looked at the middle distance. The codicil stood. The trust stood. The transfer of the house on Birch Road and the savings account were reversed on the grounds of undue influence and the absence of independent counsel, a process that had taken 9 months and produced a result that was, on paper, exactly what my grandfather had intended. $340,000. A house that had been sold, the proceeds held in escrow. My grandfather's entire accumulated life transferred carefully across the gap. Patricia Greer handed me the trust documents to sign. I signed them at the maple conference table. My grandfather's name was on the top of each page. I did not look at my father when I signed, not out of cruelty, because it would not have changed anything, and I was finished needing things to change. After the hearing, General Hawes walked me to my car. It was a cold day, the kind that smells like wood smoke and coming rain. He said, your grandfather would be glad. I said, I know. He said he was also very proud of you. Long before any of this. Long before there was anything to protect or fight over. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and I let that in. Some words arrive late. They still count. My father and I are not estranged exactly. We exist in the same family in the way of people who have seen each other clearly and found that the clarity is neither comfortable nor escapable. He calls on my birthday, I call on his. There's a quality of neutrality between us that is different from warmth and different from coldness, something that simply is what it is. He has never finished the sentence. I have stopped waiting for him to. Stephanie and I are more complicated. She called me, 2 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday evening. I answered because I am the kind of person who answers. She was quiet for a long time and then she said, I didn't know about the trust. I want you to know that. I didn't know what Dad had done with the house. I believed her. That is the truth. She is not her father's architect. She is his favorite. Those are different things. I said, I know. She said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, you don't have to fix it. We just have to decide what we do from here. We don't talk every week. We don't have lunch on birthdays. But there is something between us now that was not there before, something that might grow into something real if we tend it carefully, without pretending the past was different than it was. I do not require her to apologize for being loved first. That would not be fair. I only require honesty. The rest can take its time. General Hawes comes to dinner once a month. He lives 40 minutes away, which is the same drive I made every Sunday to my grandfather's house on Birch Road, and I find that symmetry comforting. He drinks 1 glass of wine, plays 1 game of chess, and stays until the conversation has found its natural end. He does not overstay. He does not understay. He is a man who knows exactly how long a thing should last and honors it. He told me, over dinner last spring, that my grandfather had made him promise one more thing. Teach her to beat you at chess, he'd said. She's almost there. Don't let her stop before she gets there. I am working on it. I am very close. Last month I had him in a position for 11 moves that I had never managed before. He saw it before I did. He always sees the board 3 moves ahead, but he did not move quickly. He sat with his coffee and studied it with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased to be in a difficult situation. He looked up and said, "Your grandfather would have loved this." I played my move. He beat me on move 14 anyway, but it was different than before. The gap between us is closing, and we both know it. The compass rose earrings are in a small dish on my dresser, where I can see them from my bed. I put them on for the important things: the hearing, the signing, a presentation I gave in January that went well enough that my supervisor shook my hand after and said, "I don't know how you always know where to look for the right information. I want you leading this team." I thought about my grandfather when she said that. I thought about a man who taught me to keep records, to play carefully, to show up on Sundays without being asked, to carry things without needing anyone to see me carry them. I thought about a cream envelope on a kitchen table, and the man who had written it, and the man who had driven 4 hours to stand up in a room full of strangers and say the thing my father never could. I thought about the toast, and the silence after it, and the way the general's voice had moved through that room like something that had been waiting a long time for the right moment. To Claire, who is always the real thing, there is a trust document in my filing cabinet, organized, tabbed, in order. There's a chest set on my coffee table that my grandfather left me in his personal effects, a wooden board, weighted pieces, a small crack in the Black Queen that he had repaired with wood glue and never replaced, because he said a thing that has been broken and held together is stronger at the seam. That is what I believe now about family. You do not get to choose the one you come from. You get to choose the one you build. I built mine out of a 30-year friendship between two men who kept their word. Out of a lawyer in a small office on Court Street who called me because she thought I deserved to know. Out of a November hearing that ended quietly and on paper the way the best things do. Out of a man who stood up at a wedding when it mattered. That is the family that showed up. That is the one I set a table for. The ones who need a public moment to remember I exist. I wish them well from a comfortable distance, which is the most I can honestly offer, and more than they gave me for a very long time. That's my story. A toast that got the wrong answer, an envelope on a kitchen table, and a general who stood up because an old soldier asked him to. If someone in your life keeps showing up quietly, without ceremony, without asking you to notice, go tell them today. Don't wait for a hearing date or a wedding toast. Tell them now. If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me about the person who stood up in your corner when you weren't expecting it. And subscribe, because I'm not done telling these stories, and neither, I think, are you. I'll see you in the next one.